Thanks to all of you who have joined us for this concurrent session, the Inequality Equation, Seeing Our Blind Spots. I am delighted to join you to talk a little bit about unconscious bias, something that many corporations have been talking about and have had training about, talking about the inherent biases that we have that may impact hiring decisions, retention, technology decisions, various aspects of the workplace and therefore our workforce. And here to talk with us is an expert in this area. Her name is Stephanie Creary. She is an assistant professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And Stephanie, thank you so much for being here and joining us. What I'm hoping that we're going to be able to talk about with the people that have joined us this afternoon are some of the ways that we can have a clearer understanding about how our own inherent biases may impact such things as decision-making in the workplace, interaction with our colleagues, talent recruitment, technology development. Also understanding how we can recognize these biases in ourselves and in others and how we can do something about it when we see it. What can we do? There, of course, is this whole knowledge of allyship, how important that is right now. How can that help in this realm? But also those people that we've already had in our corner, our sponsors, our mentors, how can we work with them in an effort to create a more equitable workforce? And those are all the things that I'm hoping we're going to be able to discuss today with you, Stephanie. I know this is an area that you talk about a lot. You've created a whole program and a whole curriculum for your students at Wharton about this. But why is it, let me just begin with this basic question. Why is it so important for business leaders not only to have training for employees, but to employ this training themselves and make sure that they're not using these inherent biases to continue to have systemic inequality in their workplaces?
Well, let me just begin by saying thank you so much, Sharon, for moderating this session, for having me here today. It's such a pleasure to be here to speak with you and certainly our guests. So it goes without saying that biases enter into our decision-making.
Stephanie is paused on mine. She paused. I think we just lost Stephanie. So I'm going to continue here. We're going to try to get her back on. But one of the things that I'm hoping that we can talk about, and Stephanie's going to present a few questions to those of you that are here. There we are. Sorry about that. I told you you're going to give me some questions. I kind of gave that part away, but go ahead with your introduction and then we'll get to your questions.
Absolutely. So what I was saying is it goes without saying that every day on the job we make lots of decisions, and these decisions sometimes inadvertently but also consciously end up bringing our biases forth, and they're consequential. And certainly as managers, as leaders, we're making many decisions about our business, but we're also making many decisions about people, about talent, about who gets opportunities and who doesn't. And so it becomes so important for us to not just know that we are biased, but to begin to examine the sets of decisions that we make that somehow our biases end up becoming more and more consequential. So today we're going to talk about, I have 3 scenarios for you all today that I think are common scenarios in which we can, if we think about these scenarios and think about how our biases might affect them going in, we have a better chance at stopping them from creating negative consequences for our colleagues.
Before we jump into the first question, can I just ask you in general about networking?
Yes. And
particularly networking in the environment we're in right now today. I mean, we'll talk about the normal situation as well, but how can networking, when we're networking virtually, when we're networking through our LinkedIn contacts, when we're networking without actually being face-to-face with someone in person, how can we have certain biases or make sure that we don't in those kind of virtual and electronic communications?
Yeah, so I think what's really tricky right now that we're in a virtual space is we're becoming even less focused on creating opportunities to connect. It's turn on Zoom, turn on Google Meets, and just get the job done and then leave. But when we think about our face-to-face scenarios that we were in pre-COVID, we were much more intentional in terms of just connecting with the person next to us, connecting with somebody we meet outside in the snack hall. So now what becomes increasingly important is for us to think about how do we create these spaces, whether they are break time times as structured into our virtual Zoom conferences, or whether we schedule time offline to connect with people. So much of what's happening right now is, if you look at our networks, they're very much, and our time is very much spent with people who we are working on projects with. And the art of networking isn't just about strengthening relationships with those we're already working with. It's about meeting new people. So we have to be very intentional now, even more so than prior to our lockdown situation. We have to be more intentional about finding time, creating spaces, and maybe structuring unstructured time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. Let's start with the first question that you have for the attendees. And again, this session, everyone, is going to be more interactive than probably what you've done for a large part of this afternoon. And we're going to put a question in the chat, but Stephanie will also propose it to you. And please send us your answers to that question. But also, if you have questions along the way for Stephanie, we're happy to answer your questions and make this a session that really is answering what you want to know about right now, about biases, about the inequality equation, and what we can do to really fix our blind spots here. So Stephanie, what's the first question?
Yeah, so Sharon, you started to prime us a little bit for the first question, which is a networking scenario. And so I want you to imagine a time where we'll all be able to convene again in person. And I want you to imagine that you're at a professional conference, things that you probably often did prior to COVID. And many of your colleagues are also in attendance at this conference. And so now you have a break, right? You have a break in between sessions, 15 minutes, 10 minutes or so. And I want you to tell yourself and tell us in the chat, what is it that you typically do? And so there are three options, A, B, and C. And all I'm going to ask you to do is just put in an A, B, or C. So this is where I say, don't search for the right answer. Just be really honest and transparent and tell us what it is that you typically do. So during this break in between conference sessions, do you usually A, reconnect with colleagues you haven't seen in a while, B, check your email, or C, take the opportunity to introduce a newer colleague to people he, she, or they may not know? So those are your options. A, reconnect, B, check your email, or C, take the opportunity to introduce a newer colleague to people he, she, or they may not know. So let me give you a minute. We see a few answers popping in. All you got to do is put the letter. We're going to see what you all pick.
So far, everybody's saying A, Stephanie. Does that mean they passed? That means they got the A grade?
That means they get to stop the quiz. Let's see if anybody picks anything else. You know, sometimes when you do these polls, people pick what everybody else picked. But I'm going to tell you in just a second what people tend to pick. And then we'll talk a little bit later. We'll debrief these scenarios, and I'll help you understand some of the some opportunities behind each of these options. A D, we've got a D, and that wasn't even an option. There's always that student.
Okay. Thanks to so many of you for responding. That we love.
Yes, absolutely.
And if you're wondering what the question is, it is pinned now to the top of the chat if you did not see it. And Stephanie, can you just repeat it one more time?
Yes. So you're imagining this magical day where we're finally able to all convene again in person. And you are attending a professional conference where many of your colleagues are also in attendance. So we have a break, a 10 to 15 minute break in between sessions. What do you do during that break? Do you reconnect with colleagues you haven't seen in a while? That's A. B, do you check your email? Or C, do you take the opportunity to introduce a newer colleague to people he, she, or they may not know?
We did have someone, we had another person kind of step outside the box here too.
Yes.
With C as the answer. Couple people.
Yeah. All right, what do you think, Sharon?
Well, I'd like to say that I'm not B, checking my email, but the reality is if I'm fortunate enough to go to a conference and enjoy it and I'm not, moderating it, and I may be checking my email to see what I'm missing, what I need to be catching up with for work. So that's the honest answer. Mm-hmm. But I also, if I see someone I know, it's my opportunity for my reunion. Mm-hmm. So I definitely will seek other people to connect with and reconnect with. And if I do have a colleague that I'm trying to mentor, mm-hmm. I may try to introduce them. But I will say that probably, unfortunately, falls into last place in terms of my priorities with those 10-minute breaks.
Okay, great. So let me give you the answer that most people pick, and then in a few minutes, we'll go ahead and debrief each of these answers. So most people tend to pick A, just as we've seen in the chat. So let's keep that in our memories, that most people say that they spend their break times reconnecting with colleagues they haven't seen in a while. Okay, so let's go with scenario number 2. And scenario number 2 is a workplace scenario in your actual job. And it's a team selection scenario. And many of you do this in many different ways. You pick people to be on your permanent team. You pick people for temporary teams. You pick people for project teams. So just imagine any of these teams.
Oh, wait, Stephanie, though, before we go to the next question, are you going to tell us what the answers are or kind of why most people pick A, and should they be picking C or B?
Yeah, I was actually going to come back to that, but we can do that now. Okay. Come back to it. So team selection scenario. So now you're picking a team, or you're assembling a team, and I want you to answer for us how you assemble that team. All right. So you are now assembling a team. Do you A, pick the people who you already know are high performers? Do you B, pick people based on the diversity of perspectives you would like represented on the team? Or C, do you pick people who will meet your company's or your clients' diversity requirements or aspirations? So question C is this idea that many companies, including yours, value diversity, and they highly encourage you to consider diversity when you're engaging in searches, when you're selecting people for the team. So that's what C is. B is about diversity of perspectives. C is about meeting diversity requirements or aspirations or goals. So what do you typically do? Lots of B's.
That's how I like to answer multiple choice questions. Can I do 2? Can I do A and B?
Absolutely. So Sharon, which one do you think you would do if you were in this scenario?
I mean, I would really want a diversity of opinions and perspectives. So I think I would do B.
Okay. So I'm going to do the next scenario. I'll give you the answer that most people pick. I'm going to do the next scenario, and then we're going to come back and debrief each of these so I can tell you the pros and cons of each of the options. Okay, so most people actually pick A, which is very different from this group of people on this call, but you should know when I do this poll with students, so with younger new workers, with MBA students, with middle managers, even with senior executives, most people pick A. All right, so last scenario, and then we'll break each of these down a little bit more. So question 3, or poll 3, is a talent development scenario. All right, so you're in a company, your company that you're in now is concerned about the representation of different demographic groups in leadership positions. And what that means for equity and your company's effectiveness. You are asked to come up with a strategy to help address this issue, all right? So companies concerned about underrepresentation in leadership roles, you're asked to come up with a strategy to help address this issue. What do you focus on? So option A, do you focus on including more people from underrepresented groups in important projects? So putting more people from underrepresented groups in projects. Do you B, focus on giving people from underrepresented groups more constructive feedback? So giving them more idea of how they're performing and what they need to do in order to be successful in your company. Or do you C, focus on encouraging more people from underrepresented groups to take leadership roles? So telling them to raise their hand or in effect lean in. So what do you do? Do you try to include more of them on projects? Do you try to give people from underrepresented groups more constructive feedback? Or do you encourage people from underrepresented groups to sign up, to raise their hand, in effect, volunteering themselves for important leadership roles? What do you tend to do? D, we got a D again, Sharon. So we got a few, mostly A's and C's. Okay, we'll give it another minute, another couple seconds or so. All right, So what most people tend to pick is C in this scenario. They tend to focus on encouraging people from underrepresented groups to take leadership roles. So Sharon, I think we should talk a little bit.
I would have said A.
Yeah,
I would have said A for that one,
right.
Because, you need to make sure they have the opportunities to have different experiences,
right.
And make sure they're included in this so that then they can take a leadership role. I mean, I think just saying to take a leadership role and raise your hand and put the onus on them, I think it's the onus on, colleagues and managers and leaders to include, in the different projects. But that's
absolutely
my opinion.
Well, let's start with this question, and we'll work our way backwards since it's most recent. And let's talk about some of the upsides and the downsides to each of these selections. I think, Sharon, you already started to help us understand what happens if you do C and not A or B. But what would you foresee are some of the challenges behind just focusing on A? Can you think of what the downsides might be, or what might be flagged? And we think about biased decision making. Can we think about what the issues or challenges might be? And also, those of you who are participating online, you can put in the chat why you think if we only did A, what would be problematic here, or what would be some of the mistaken assumptions or the biases that would be entering in place if we only focused on including people from underrepresented groups in important projects. It's a tricky one.
Well, I think people just are concerned that would they really want to do that role, or have they really done it before?
Right.
And I don't want to mix the different questions, but to the point of, you need to be a high achiever. You need to have already proven that you can do it. And in some cases, those opportunities just have not been available to certain groups because they may not be in that particular business unit and in great force or what have you. So I think that it's difficult to, some may see it as difficult in creating those opportunities, but they just have to be created.
Yeah, absolutely. I think certainly you've nailed one potential limitation. I think if we look at the chat, there is a response here about qualified candidates from represented majorities might feel that preference is being given and resent the attempt at giving opportunity to others. I would say that is certainly a concern when we don't say that Sharon possesses these key skills, which is why she's on this team. So much of this is about not tokenizing people who are underrepresented by just putting them on a project because now you've decided diversity is important. But how do you effectively include Sharon in this project by saying, we need Sharon on this team because she has decades of experience as a personal finance reporter. She's sharp, she knows how to ask brilliant questions and really get to the heart of the matter. That's what doesn't always happen when we are putting people on teams, especially people who are underrepresented. We often fail to introduce them by their skills and their abilities, which perpetuates the notion among majority group members that they're just there to check the box. So with respect to giving people from underrepresented groups more constructive feedback, the limitation to that is making the assumption that it's feedback that is effectively holding someone back, that they haven't gotten the feedback, or that the feedback that they are getting has been sufficient. So we certainly want to give people who are underrepresented constructive feedback, and certainly the types of feedback that we're giving other people as well. But we know, and research says, that there's so much more than feedback that is actually preventing the success and the advancement of people who are underrepresented in organizations. So let's not oversimplify the rationale behind what's preventing people's success. And certainly C, as you had started us off, Sharon, goes with that, with this idea that And there's been a lot of research that suggests that some people, including women, may not be volunteering themselves for roles because they don't feel like they possess, 9 out of the 10 criteria. But when it comes to people of color, and specifically women of color, what we've learned is that's actually not the barrier. The barrier is that women of color particularly are leaning in or trying to lean into the opportunity and being told to lean back out. So we oftentimes have different standards for different people. And what's happening is the encouragement alone isn't sufficient. What is really needed for people who are underrepresented is advocacy and sponsorship, not just encouragement to say you should take the leadership role. No, I think as a leader, you have to be willing to stand up and speak up for those who haven't been given the opportunity.
Can you talk a little bit about feedback as well? Because I think feedback, there's a lot of concern about where feedback is coming from. Does it come from the direct manager? Is that the feedback that one was looking for? A colleague or someone that you are that is under in terms of your management cycle? So should it be a 360 view of feedback? And how does that change the biases when that's the type of feedback that's being considered versus a feedback that's just from your immediate manager, supervisor?
Yeah, so before I answer that in more detail, more specifically, I want to say that we need to train people to give better feedback, because a lot of most people don't know how to give feedback, right? And they might know that there's positive feedback and negative feedback, but they don't know what biased feedback is. And so it becomes really important to anybody who's given feedback, whether they're a direct report of the person who is seeking the feedback or whether they are a senior manager. We need to establish criteria and guidelines and trainings that teach people what is constructive feedback and here's how you give that type of feedback. But to your question around, its importance, yes, 360 feedback is really important at all stages of the career life cycle, but certainly in those places in the career where we see perhaps some of the slowing down of the success of certain groups. So middle management to senior management, 360 feedback becomes so important because we know that many promotions are determined not just on your individual success, but on your capacity to actually develop others. So we need to hear from your direct reports. How are you doing as a leader? And you need to hear that as a leader, how are you doing, in order to help catapult you to the next level.
Excellent.
So should we talk about team selection scenario and some of the upsides and downsides of these options here? Okay, so you're assembling a team. One option is to pick the people who you already know are high performers. The downside with that choice is that you're oftentimes not thinking about your bench. You're not thinking about the people who have potential. And if all we're doing is developing the same people and giving the same opportunities to the people who are already strong, then we have issues oftentimes with succession planning. So we need to make sure that we have not just all of our resources and our energy are going to the people who are already doing well. We need to make sure that we're spreading our resources and our opportunities to the people who are coming straight from behind them. And so that's sort of what you want to think about. High performers are great, but so are people with potential. And how do we adopt a growth mindset when we're thinking about developing talent and including people on teams? And certainly the idea of picking people based on the diversity of perspectives you would like represented, which is option B, is really important. The caveat here is we don't all necessarily agree on what diversity of perspectives means. So diversity of perspectives means we pick people based on what their college major was, based on what their professional role is, based on what level they are in the organization. It could be all of those things. It could be none of those things. But my guidelines for you and those who are establishing teams and trying to create diverse teams is really specify what are you sampling diversity of perspectives on, and be consistent so that you're not just making assumptions around diversity of thought when you might not actually be getting what you're wishing for. And then certainly there's always the question around picking people who will meet your company's or your clients' diversity requirements or aspirations. Similar to the last note is, inadvertently we end up tokenizing people, and we perpetuate the notion that women or people of color or those who are underrepresented who are now on this team are only there because of their demographic characteristics. And that becomes harmful to people's careers and certainly to their self-esteem. But what I have learned in my research is that a lot of people fall to option C, picking people who will meet the requirements, because they don't fully understand the rationale for diversity. So this becomes an area of opportunity for leaders, is make sure if you do have a diversity platform and you want your managers and leaders to create more diverse teams, that you're helping them to make that link. It's not about checking boxes. It's not about hitting targets. It's about creating a team that can be more creative and innovative because there are more opportunities to hear different perspectives on that team.
So can you be a little more specific about how you go from the targets to the perspectives, so that if you do have targets that have been set out by your company, how do you reach those targets by still having a framework that includes high performers, those who are going to support the bench, those, and the diversity of perspectives that you were mentioning before? Yeah,
so targets are often aspirational. It helps us to establish the fact that we shouldn't settle for perhaps there just being one person. So that's what I think the first thing to break apart is what is the role of a target? But we're only able to create diverse teams when we are creating attractive opportunities on the team. So whether it's recruiting people from the outside or recruiting people to your internal team, we need to make sure that the environment that we're creating is inclusive. And in the context of a team, that means Do I have an opportunity to have my ideas heard? Is that a team that allows people to actually contribute their ideas? When I contribute my idea, do people actually acknowledge that I've spoken, or do they talk over me and dismiss me? So we don't want that. We want people to actually acknowledge their ideas. And when I put my ideas out there, I'm courageous enough to put my ideas out there, are they actually ever integrated into the team? And so what I'm suggesting is that if you create the culture that where people who, no matter where they are, feel like they can come into your team, into your organization, contribute their ideas, and have some chance at getting them integrated into the fold of the work, the diversity will be attracted to your team. But if your team if your organization or if your environment, if your team seems like it does not want me or my ideas there, you're not going to attract the diversity that you need, if that makes sense.
Excellent. Can we get to the last scenario? And then I have a question from one of our attendees.
Okay, absolutely. So the last scenario was the networking scenario. And this is, what do you do during breaks? And I told you that most people focus on reconnecting. So that's great. You always want to strengthen relationships, but you know, when you focus on talking to the same people, you're connecting around similarity, people who are like you, and you're never getting the chance to meet new people. So all this talk around wanting more diversity on your team, you're missing opportunities by only talking to people who you already know. Checking your email. I think this is actually a really great strategy during professional conferences. I don't know about you, Sharon, but I've been at many professional conferences. I've checked my email, and I've found that other people are actually at that same event that I am. I just don't stay on I try not to stay on my email all day checking work emails. So be intentional and mindful about what you're checking your email for. Don't spend time doing work when you could be spending time connecting. And then finally, taking the opportunity to introduce a newer colleague. Yes, it goes without saying. One of the barriers that people who are underrepresented face, and oftentimes stalls their career paths in organization, is that they're not getting the benefit of being introduced to people who are important for them to meet, to begin to solicit as clients, or just to begin to get advice, or begin to engage as sponsors and mentors. And so by you as a leader taking the opportunity to actively introduce newer colleagues to other people, open up your network, you're starting to reduce the biased behavior that we often see at networking, which is just people talking to their own social network without being inclusive of others.
Very important point. Very important point. One of the participants was asking a question about feedback, and we talked about how there needs to be training. You were talking about how there needs to be training on feedback for managers to have that kind of training, how to give the right type of feedback. But how do you receive feedback? How important is it to kind of have training on how to receive feedback, and particularly in this environment where you may not be having the one-on-one in-person meeting and your face-to-face meeting with the person who's giving you feedback is this way, or just on an email? Yeah,
so hard, but so important. I would say the same principle applies. Adopt a growth mindset. You as a leader are trying to learn and grow, and feedback helps you learn and grow. So how do we begin to teach our managers, our employees, our senior leaders that feedback is about growth? It's not about punishment, right? And sometimes it feels like a punishment when the delivery is all wrong. But how do we help people to understand, and what experiences do we put them through in order for them to begin to see these as growth opportunities? And I think the more that we can do that, the more that people will feel comfortable receiving feedback and actually creating action items based on the feedback they're receiving.
Well, Stephanie, we're going to have to, I think, leave it there. I want to make sure that people know how they can find you. Stephanie Creary from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania also has her own website. So you want to go to stephaniecreary.com and sign up for her monthly newsletter, Leap at Work. A lot of you have already put in comments about how helpful her tips and suggestions have been. You know, she can be guiding you along the way of this journey as we're working in our corporations on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we thank you so much for being here and for guiding us on this topic. We're going to continue this topic, talking about systemic inequities, talking about what corporations need to do to dismantle these inequities with Darren Walker, the president of the Ford Foundation. That'll be coming up next on the main stage. I hope you join me for that. And to get to the main stage, you just have to click on the left-hand side of your screen. That will bring you to the main stage. Again, thank you for joining us for this session. Please continue to stay in touch with Stephanie Creary. And Stephanie, thank you for allowing me to be with you this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.